I'm Louise Krasniewicz, and the date is October 9th, 2008, and we're at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. And I'm a research scientist here. Michelle Crone, who is one of the early organizers of the encampment, was looking for women who had access to video cameras who could come and document it. And you remember back in '83, not a lot of women had access to video cameras. So everybody who did came to the encampment. So she recruited me, and I had video cameras at work. So I brought them along several weekends in August. I couldn't come for the whole time. And it was Michelle, more than anybody else, who kept me informed about what was going on with the developments of the Peace Camp. I was a little hesitant at first, thousands of women getting together, how are they going to deal with toilets and food and so on. And she was probably the best advocate I could have imagined for selling the idea of this to everybody who was interested in being involved. I was living in Albany, New York, where Michelle was, and I don't know how we knew each other, but Albany was a small community of women activists and artists, and we were just part of the same community. We had a lot of friends in common, artist friends, and we lived pretty close to each other in one of the downtown neighborhoods. So that was it. We were just part of a community of people who did lots of different things together. So when the Peace Camp, she started doing the Peace Camp work, I heard about it all the time. I was working at a pharmacy college there. I was their media director, and I think that really lit up Michelle's eyes because I had access to video cameras because I was doing media production for the college. So it was a great connection, and I brought along with me two other artists that I did other work with. One was a photographer, one was a musician, and so they came along and helped with all of the videotaping that we did. And I went twice, I believe, for a couple of days each time, and videotaped, did interviews like this, and talked to people about why they were there and what they had brought and what they were expecting to get from it. And it was just an amazing experience. But it was first through that Albany community where a lot of the women organizers, the early organizers, lived. And not all of them, but Michelle, of course, had contacts with everybody. I mean, she knew everybody, and that was a big factor in getting all of us involved. And now I just remember where I met Michelle. Maybe I didn't meet her, but we were both involved in women's studies at SUNY Albany, and she was teaching a women in film course, and I was teaching popular culture and anthropology, and so we would talk about that. And then okay, I don't want to ruin this for you.
It's fine. Actually, okay. With that close to you, we're not getting a lot of that.
And one time she couldn't teach her women in film course and asked me to teach it, and I'm still teaching film because of that. So I have that to thank her for as well. But yeah, we were involved in women's studies at Albany and a lot of the sort of political activities that came out of that. She was much more involved on the national level, certainly, than I was. But yeah, there was a wonderful community of women doing lots of different things around the arts and around activism. So we went to Seneca Falls first and hung out there for a little bit just to get in the mood. And so we went to the Women's Hall of Fame and got the history part. Then we drove down, and I would say from the moment we walked onto the land, it was just amazing. It was just an amazing experience. You never saw so many different kinds of women there for the same purpose, or what at the moment we thought was the same purpose. And that's why, to me, it got really interesting. And the first thing, of course, you do is you go off and volunteer for jobs, and they said, no, you have a job. Document. And so that's what we did, day and night, just documented. We went to everything. We went to every action that was taking place. We went to people when they were doing their laundry, and they invented a laundry action while they were doing their laundry. And so we were trying to not just document the big actions, but we wanted the everyday experience. And I think that was our contribution, to look at what people were doing every day, not just the big protests where you had thousands of people and everybody there with their cameras photographing. We wanted, when those things were being planned or they had already been done, what were women doing there every day? So we went to endless meetings. Of course, there were endless meetings, and taped how people were talking and what they were talking about. And to me, that was a lot more interesting in some ways. We went once in August and once in July. So we weren't there for the first week. We weren't there for the opening, but we were there soon after that. And there were changes, over time. There was the whole flag controversy, which I ended up writing about and researching. And the women from Elmira, I guess it was, who caused such a stir. And I, at the time, was deciding to go back to school in anthropology. I wasn't at that moment back in graduate school, but that fall decided that this was the kind of work I wanted to do. It was really important for us as scholars to look at this kind of work. So went back and signed up for a PhD in anthropology and did my dissertation for the next couple of years on the sort of aftermath of all this, the reaction of the community in years after, and of the women who went to the camp and tried to keep alive what the first year had developed. So it was fascinating process from the first year on through the next several years, and after the first event. A lot of women were there to experience being with other women and finding out what it was like when women got together and did a political action, or explored each other's cultures, or tried to find out about other women, not just what I think of as the external activities of then going to the army depot and protesting. I love the combination of the two, but I was fascinated by the fact that there were often women who had never done anything like this before, never had this experience, never even thought to do something like this. When we talk to Walda, we'll find out why, people came to do this. I mean, I had other reasons for being there. Why did they come? That was the question for me. Why did women come to do this? It was a moment in history that all the things that were happening in the culture came together at that moment, and it was a spectacular moment, and I didn't want to lose that. And after talking to Michelle Crone a lot and some of the other organizers, and being on the camp land for a very short period of time, I knew that that's what I didn't want us to lose that. Because now, 25 years later, we're going back and asking women this again. What was it like for you? What was the experience? Not necessarily how many protests were there, how many actions were there. What was it like to be a woman in the 1980s, making these statements, doing these actions, wearing these clothes, confronting the local, and some of the clothes, have you seen the pictures? We're all wearing these little shorts. It's just really horrifying. But, what was it like at the moment? And I've carried that through in my work instead of looking at culture from the top down. I'm always interested in looking at it from what are real people living through. And so that's what I was trying to do. If there was one theme, it was people were there to explore, to open up their possibilities. I can look at that now and say, oh, that's what they were there for. Because still in the 80s, or even in the 80s, things had not opened up yet for women and what they could do and how they could change their identities and how they could act in different ways. It still hadn't. And so for women to take this really bold step in the face of the military, I think just attracted so many different kinds of people. So I think it was if that's too general, that's okay. I think that's what women were doing. Everybody was there for a specific reason, whether it was religious or sexual or spiritual or political, but they found out that there were other people there for different reasons, and that's where the dynamic stuff really happened. It was just amazing. It was Michelle Crone who tried to establish that she wanted me, and a lot of the other women wanted me, or the rest of us who were documenting, to make sure that we didn't miss things because we shouldn't be looking at things we were just personally involved in. It's important to open up ourselves as much as everyone else who was there to new possibilities. So if you just videotaped your friends, for example, or just videotaped certain kinds of women, that's not doing the job that Herstory needs, which is to make sure that in the future women looking at this event can get a bigger picture than just a narrow point of view, because we were so used to that narrow point of view from what we were getting from either the mainstream media or male-dominated media. And so I had what I thought were good but endless arguments about, no, you need to be involved in this ritual. I said, no, someone needs to stand out and show everything that's happening in this ritual, because you're going to want to know later. Right now you might want me involved, later you're going to want a record of it. And it's the ultimate dilemma of the anthropologist or any other kind of observer, that do you get involved, do you stay separate? I mean, we were every time we were in a meeting, the camera was just sitting there and we were participating as anyone else would. But I felt that participating by talking to other women was exactly what everybody else was doing. We just happened to have a camera. Some women were writing journals, some women were drawing pictures, some women were photographing. We were just doing it with video, which at the time, of course, was pretty new in terms of everybody having access to it. Now it's just, of course, your brother has the camera, you have to borrow it, but at the time it was pretty new. But people were documenting in their own ways, and it's wonderful that a lot of that has been saved, whether it's women's journals or letters that they've written to the encampment. So we were as involved as anyone else in terms of sitting at meals and sitting at 3-4 hour long meetings. But when it came to actions, we documented rather than participated, because for one thing, you didn't want to go over the fence with a camera because you'd never get it back, and it wasn't my camera. And we needed it to document the next day. But yeah, we made that decision ahead of time. I didn't start with the idea of doing the peace camp for my research. The experience of the peace camp and doing the kinds of interviews I had done as an undergraduate, I just loved doing that again. But I didn't think, well, I really want to be a documentary filmmaker. That's not what I wanted. I really wanted to ground that kind of experience in the academic world in anthropology, which I knew. So I went back, started taking courses, always kept writing about the peace camp until finally several people on my committee, my dissertation committee, said, why aren't you doing your PhD on this? And I said, I didn't think I could. So they loved the idea, and that's when I started going back and lived in the community for about 6 months and interviewed both who was ever at the peace camp at the time and the people in the local community who certainly had not forgotten what had happened a year or two earlier. And that became a big part of trying to come up with a picture, a wider picture. I'm not saying balanced, or I'm not saying it's the whole picture, but it's a picture from many perspectives. That's, to me, what was interesting, that there were a lot of different ways of looking at this, partly because there were so many people involved. Absolutely, same thing. In fact, every anthropologist has it in every community she goes into. In the local community, for example, I played on the softball team, but then I also got invited to the country club. You want to see how weird all that stuff is. And so I got friendly with women who were in the local community who had a lot to say, including the woman who sat down with the women at the Waterloo Bridge. We still correspond, in fact. And then there were the women who were at the camp who had made a commitment to keeping a women's community alive there, but it had changed from what it was in '83. And so documenting that change and showing how the local people just sort of combined all these years together into one story that they were using to explain it all, that was interesting to me. So, I was just teaching my class today and telling my students about that you were coming, and saying that one of the things I was studying at the time time was how people used symbols as sort of weapons against each other. So different kinds of symbols were used to establish identities and then be used both for and against that identity. And it was fascinating, but it was also sort of personally really rewarding to watch women do these things. I mean, to me, it always came back to that. I always say, if you don't, as an academic, if you don't do something you're passionate about on some level or another, it's going to haunt you for most of the rest of your life, that you've committed to something that's not important to you personally. Oh, yes. The Peace Camp used one of the smartest things done at the Peace Camp, and I don't know how this happened, was the development of a symbol system. Every community, if you want to establish an identity, if you want people to know who you are and to feel part of your community, you establish a set of symbols. I mean, it just sort of happens. It doesn't always happen purposefully, it just happens. At the Peace Camp, one of the symbols was the web. Perfect symbol. Remember, there was no web as in World Wide Web at the time. So the web was a symbol that said a lot. It said that women in all sorts of different places and different positions are connected by a variety of concerns, and one of which is nuclear weapons. So the symbol of the web, which was painted on buildings and used during actions and just used in a variety of different ways during conversation all the time, during the meetings, was very important. The circle was the other one. So circles were protective symbols. Women gathered at night in circles. So, back to your question, we would participate in all of the ritual activities like circles, where women had a chance for that sort of protective symbolic space. And so circles were used in again, a variety of ways in conversation and in things that were painted in t-shirts and posters and in the organization of the encampment. So those are probably the two big ones. Another one that drove the local people nuts was the labrys, the symbol. Drove them nuts because they didn't know what it was. They could figure out the web, and if you told them the circle, they could kind of get, what the heck are they? And so, that was a great sort of internal symbol, and it was just sort of a little aggressive act, against the power of the nuclear weapons, because it was always used against the army depot. But that's one of the things that was fun about talking to all sides, was that the local people could not for the life, because they had no experience with the symbol, figure out what that was. So those are the kinds of symbols. And then when you had some women come in who didn't agree with everything the Peace Camp did, the symbols became part of the fight. And probably the biggest symbol fight was over the American flag. So you had the local guy, Emerson Moran, who was doing this to make a point. He wasn't doing this accidentally. I mean, I got friendly with Emerson, and he was purposely trying to provoke the Peace Camp to make a statement, to side with his symbol, the American flag. And so the discussions about the American flag, which went on throughout the summer, even though it seemed to be resolved, every time it got resolved, it started up again. Does the Peace Camp accept an American flag and fly it on the 4th of July? And the decision, of course, to make our own American flags as opposed to flying the one Emerson Moran wanted the camp to fly, was a brilliant strategy for the camp, but drove, again, the local people crazy, because it was clear that the camp had made an anti-American statement. So that's how I was interested in symbols being used as a sort of weapons, both for your community, to build your community, but also to sort of identify the other, who's not a member of your community. The discussions were endless about the American flag, and there had been several meetings where women sat down and tried to make a decision about whether the flag should be flown. And when one of the times we were there, people had just had this meeting, were making the flags, and then the flags were flown on laundry lines in the front yard. So it was wonderful that some positive action had been taken, but everybody got to make their own kind of flags. So those kinds of things were going on right in the beginning. It wasn't sort of after the fact I sort of discovered these symbols. No, this was a part of a living community, and I just
for some reason was able to say, oh, that's an important symbol, better photograph that, better make a record of that. And a lot of people did that. A lot of the symbols were openly discussed as being important for the identity of the community, to keep it going, to keep it coherent. So that it wasn't, as in many communities that are just establishing, those conversations are very wide open. They're not hidden symbols. I found everybody wanted to talk about the experience. I mean, there were some women who wanted it to be more private, but I can't think of anyone who refused to be photographed, because I would always ask if someone wanted to be photographed, who refused to be interviewed. Very few, and that was fine. But no, and I think afterwards, when I went back for several years afterwards, people were very interested in talking about it because it had affected a lot of people. And I don't know how many local people you'll be talking to, but I think you'll be surprised even now if you go back how it still hangs in the air and how people were so affected by what happened then. I kept in touch with a lot of the community people, for a long time as a way to find out what they were, continuing to think about this. So Seneca Falls, Waterloo, some of the guys at the VFW hall, my buddies there, some of the local women. Those contacts are really interesting because I think people want to remember, what the possibilities were then, especially if you look at the situation we're in now. The possibilities then were so thrilling. Can that ever happen again? Can we ever have those possibilities? And that's why I think what you're doing is important, because you want to get that message out to especially young women today that we did something. I mean, we're not just being crabby old ladies saying you're not doing anything, but this is possible. We lived through this. We made this possible. Don't let it intimidate you that you can't do this. You can, and make changes. I mean, shocking changes, perhaps surprised even us. But that ends up sounding like a generational problem, when I don't want to imply that at all. I don't think that would be the big issue. I think the big issue is that we have had little wedges put in between all of us that are artificial wedges. And I think what the Peace Camp did in that year was show that those wedges, which were in the culture at that time, were fake, were false. And women coming together for what they thought was one reason, they suddenly realized, oh my Lord, it really is more about, finding out that we had something in common, as women, for example. However, then you end up, the big discussion at the time was, all women have something in common, and all women should band together because they have inherently something to contribute that's different. But then you get, and I hate to bring this up, but then you get a Sarah Palin, and you say, what connection would the Peace Camp have had to a woman like Sarah Palin, who is now representing all womanhood? I mean, she is. And so maybe the moment is ripe for a Sarah Palin Peace Camp or anti-Sarah Palin Peace Camp, because what it does, it calls into question what we were saying, that women have a reason to get together, just because you're a woman and then you contribute all the other stuff that you have. Maybe it's not true, because these are the kind of women, the next generation we brought up. It's the Sarah Palin. Something got mistranslated along the way, and it's scary stuff. I knew what my thesis was, which came from the reports, the mass media reports, which was that the reason that the local people hated the encampment was that it was an economic drain on the community. And I said, utter nonsense, bullshit, because Nothing I ever heard in the whole time I was there from either the encampment or the local community had anything to do with the economic impact. And it had been, that's the story that got retranslated and sent out, that this is why they hated the encampment women. So my job, I thought, was to go in and find out what were the reasons that the local people didn't like the encampment women. I was taking that as my premise because I thought it was a pretty good premise. It was pretty easy to prove. And it turned out, I thought I was able to show that they didn't like them because they were challenging the category of women, of what women were supposed to be. Not just that, what they expected local women to be, but what they thought women in general were supposed to be. And that was that's not what I had gone in to find out. I just knew that the first premise was wrong, but I didn't know what the answer was. And the answer came mostly from the local people who were very open about talking to me about it. They didn't have any interest in hiding what they thought what the problem was, and it got repeated over and over again in all the different ways I think that I documented. So it was an eye-opener for me to find out that I hadn't expected exactly this, but I expected that it was something other than you cost them money. In fact, the encampment did not cost them money. They ended up with a big influx of money from the federal government. So that argument was gone immediately. So what was it? Well, the thing is, when it's the same thing that happens to any community when you challenge it from the outside, which is that you show up the differences that are within the community already. And you remind people that it's not as uniform as you think it is, it's not as calm as you think it is. And so that the local community was shown as much as the encampment was that, my thesis that developed out of this is the idea of the difference within, that the differences within their community were frightening to them. They started seeing that there were local women who agreed with the peace camp women. There were women who didn't act like they expected women to act, and so on. And that became an issue within the encampment itself, of course, because the encampment, with the idea that women could all harmoniously get together and work on something, that got challenged by women who came in and said, well, wait, no, we wouldn't do it this way. So and for the premise to be correct, it would have to apply to both communities, and I think it worked out. But I thought it was a wonderful thing to be able to document that what we hear as an explanation for an amazing event like that sort of neutralizes its power, and you have to say, no, that's probably not what happened. Let's go find out what happened. Well, there's a difference between a dissertation and a book. And a dissertation has very specific requirements in terms of how you word things and how you theorize things and all the chapters you write. You don't have a lot of choices in that. I made some choices. I dramatized one event because I thought the idea of drama was very important. But you have some very specific requirements that you have to meet if you want to get the degree. And is the degree important? Yes, because then you become a more legitimate spokesperson for certain ideas. That's just the way of the world. I'm not going to fight against it, and I'm glad I did it. But the book then comes out of the dissertation, and in order to get a book published, you have to meet certain requirements and put certain things in. But they were actually very open to letting me experiment with it. And then the book, of course, couldn't have real people's names and information that people didn't want shared. It's ended up being used in peace courses all over the country, and still gets used. Every once in a while I get like a little $10 check, $20 check. They're still selling the book. And you guys found it online. It gets resold over and over. So in terms of I still hear from people who say, oh, I used that book in my class, I read that book. I think in terms of introducing some other approaches in anthropology, I think that's what it's most appreciated for. And so it's referenced mostly for what it did in terms of anthropological reporting, not necessarily for the content, except for the courses in peace studies, which have had their ups and downs. But and that's become very common for people to look at social situations as dramas, and that no claim that you can report on an event that you weren't directly watching, so dramatize it, call it a dramatization, and see what happens if you try to dramatize an event. And so the dramatization I did was all based on reports and interviews. I mean, what people actually said to me happened. So, but I just wasn't there watching it. It was because most of it took place in Waterloo, and I wasn't there. In terms of locals, I mean, I went there afterwards. I didn't do any talks or anything in the community, but I sent copies to everyone that I knew. I mean, they all liked it and read it, but I've published several books since then. People don't react to your books unless you're a big seller and a very famous publisher. People don't send you reactions to your books. There was a lot of disagreement about the way I described experiences at the peace camp because certain women didn't have those experiences. But it was a composite of all different kinds of women, and perhaps they didn't talk to the women that I talked to. So I wasn't making anything up. There were a lot of women who just didn't have the same experiences and didn't go for the same reasons and couldn't possibly have the same experience. And then I actually made an effort to go talk to the Elmira women and say, well, what happened? Because everybody talked about them. They're like there was these mystical figures, and they were just these two women who were kind of into this goofy experience. So you have to actually give people a voice, whether you like what they have to say or not. And so a lot of the women at the later encampments didn't like that these two women got a voice. And I said, sorry, they have to have a voice. They're part of the experience. And if you want to accurately tell all the different issues and problems and women who came, that's what you do. So, and I am, very glad I met them. They were like no women I had ever met before, and they were great. They were hospitable, and they were open, and they were absolutely fascinating. Not anybody I would, spend my life with, but they were fascinating. So, but I think that was part of the criticism of one or two, or I don't know how many peace camp women who wrote reviews or published things online later, saying that this was not my experience. It's not supposed to be your experience. It's supposed to be looking at everyone's experiences and what kind of story do we make out of all the experiences that were there. Some people don't like, using academic terms. Well, if you want to get published by an academic publisher, you're not going to write in one way. You're going to, we can ask Walter this. How do you get something published that's both an activist experience and in an academic press? I mean, the juggling you have to do that is amazing. So, yeah, the base was not, they weren't interested in talking to me, but the sheriff's office and local officials, absolutely. So I talked to everyone that I could. I mean, I rode around Seneca County one night with Dale Arcangeli, the deputy. I mean, just the stories these guys had to tell, because this was the biggest event of their life. These women coming in made their community important and made their jobs important. They had important decisions to make, and they were important guys, and they kept the peace, and that was important. And so that's what I thought was really necessary to show, that you couldn't possibly know those stories unless you went into the local community and say, what was happening? Well, we all got overtime, and nothing ever happens in this sleepy little town. And then these women come in, and yeah, it was a pain in the neck, but boy, was it interesting. And there was no hatred in the sense of we wish they had never come. There was just retrospectively, this was, a very important event in our community, and I wonder if they still talk about it today, If you went there and talked to them, I bet you get the stories. But yeah, I talked to all the local officials, whether it was the county officials or the people in more local level. The base was not interested in discussing it. Well, I have continued to study communities, so I'm very interested in how communities get formed, and how people need communities to carry out any kind of action they're interested in their life. And I actually taught a course on communities here at Penn and used the Peace Camp as one of our modules. So we went back. My students wrote the Wikipedia entry on the Peace Camp because there was nothing up there. And so that's the way that you sort of perpetuate the influence of the Peace Camp, by saying to students, look, this is something that you're learning about, but there's nothing in the most important online documentation program. Go in and do it. Now, they didn't, do a perfect job, but they got it started so that there's now something for people to contribute. So that was one thing we did, and I've, thought for years about working it all up into a website. But it takes time. And so I've gone back and used the example of the Peace Camp for a lot of different things, whether it's to teach people how important symbols are in forming communities, or how important community is in everyday life. So it's come up over and over. It's not something I've ever left behind. As it faded through the years and there were less and less women there, and the local people had basically come to just accept them as a neighbor, the thing that's most interesting when you're doing research is some kind of conflict or some kind of issue or some kind of experience that you can widen out and say this happens in other places. But to just be a good neighbor means that, in a sense, you have to move on to another subject. As a researcher, you move on to another subject to give you another example of the same thing, or a variation of the same thing. I wish there had been more work by women in terms of writing fictions related to the encampment. I had always thought of doing that because I loved writing my fictional chapter, but it didn't happen, and I'm not sure that that's the way women took it back to their communities, because we know they took it back. And I think the thing that would be interesting for me now, for example, when I found out that Waldo was there, was find out how women took that experience back to their community rather than to keep following the same community over. So you look at the web, you go back to the symbol of the web. How did it reach out across the country and across the world? That's what you're doing, and that's what I think is interesting, because then you say it didn't end with a piece of land that had less women on it after a few years. So what? That's not where it lives, on a piece of land. I had asked for my FBI documents to check and see what was being said. I didn't have any. I was so disappointed. That's your influence. If the FBI is not after you, well, what did you do?
Step it up.
Yeah, next time.